Today we're going to be looking at this. This is a machine I picked up off a local classified not too long ago. It's a Pentium 200 MMX and it had a Voodoo 1 and a bunch of other goodies in it. It was quite a nice little find. And I always kind of wondered, this is the first machine that I've ever owned that had a Pentium 1 with MMX. Even back in the day, I only had a Pentium 133, I think it was, and the next machine I got after that was a Pentium 2, and by that time everything had MMX, so it didn't really matter. But I remember in the time that I had that Pentium 133, I yearned for MMX, so I kind of wondered what the difference was, if it would have made any difference if I'd bought myself an equivalent chip. Not that there was an MMX 133, but if there was, would it have made a difference? So today I've got two chips sitting on top of this machine here and I'm going to compare them. One is a normal Pentium-s at 200 megahertz and the other one is a Pentium MMX at 200 megahertz. So I'm not even sure how to do this, but I'm going to see if I can compare them and see if it really was worth spending the money on the MMX. I was going to do some other stuff while I'm in here. So at the minute this thing's got a Matrox Millennium and a 4 megabyte Voodoo card in it, but I'm going to replace it with this Voodoo Banshee, 60 megabyte Voodoo Banshee. It's PCI 1, so this machine only has PCI and ISA slots. It's the card that I had, this very card, a Maxi Gamer Phoenix Voodoo Banshee back in the 90s and my Pentium 133, so I'm going to relive a little bit of that and make this the new permanent home for my Voodoo Banshee. One of the reasons why I wanted to do this as well was I got this recently for cheap off eBay. It's some kind of OEM pack. It obviously was a Pentium or a Pentium chip that it came with, and it's just 4 MMX titles. So we've got Pod, Third Dimension Eraser, and The Ultimate Human Body. All MMX titles, so I thought it'd be fun to see how these run and try and compare them. We'll just get the lid off because we've got a few hardware changes to make before we proceed any further with this test. We'll get the pass-through cable off the Voodoo and we'll pop the first of these cards out, which is a 4 megabyte Matrox Mystique. I think I said Millennium before, but it's actually a Mystique. And the other card is a Voodoo, 4 megabyte Voodoo card. I thought this was a Monster 3D, but it's actually another Guillemot Maxi Gamer, so it's the same series as the card we're going to replace it with, which is nice. And then there's a Sound Blaster 16 in here as well, plug and play. I'm going to pop that out because it's got an empty Wave Blaster header and I just happen to have one of those Serta Shop S2 Wave Blaster thingy-jigs that is looking for a home, so it can go on this card so we can get some decent MIDI music when we play our DOS games. Finally, we need to swap the processor out because, as I said, it's got a Pentium 200 MMX already in this machine and I want to start doing the testing with just the basic non-MMX Pentium 200. So just pop that chip off. The other one's just going to be almost a drop-in replacement because the multiplier and bus speed are the same. The only difference is, of course, the voltage is different because the replacement, the Pentium-s, has just a simple 3.5 volt for everything, whereas the MMX one has a split voltage, so I think it's 3.3 volts on the I/O side of things and 2.8 for the core. And on this motherboard it's easy to change because everything's already set for the speeds, as I said, and there's two little jumpers. You just need to put them on. When they're off, it's set for split voltage, and when they're on, it's set for single voltage. Just need to get the heatsink back onto the CPU, and then I can fire it up and see if I've broken it. Looks like it's booting up okay, so we'll go into Windows 98. This still has all sorts of rubbish on it from when I bought it. I need to give it a proper clean out at some point. And all that needs changing here is to put the new drivers on for the Voodoo Banshee, and then the next thing I was going to do is try one of those MMX games off that OEM pack that I got. Now this is where I show my naivety. I don't really know anything about MMX, having never really looked at it properly before. So the first thing I found here was MMX games don't run on non-MMX processors, which kind of threw a spanner in the works of the point of this video, because I was actually just going to use this disc, these 4 games, to compare between Non-MMX and MMX, and I assumed that MMX titles worked with Non-MMX chips. Because it was in my head. I had Pod back in the day. It was the first proper 3D game I ever bought, and I thought I was running it on my Pentium 133, but it must have been later when I had my Pentium 2. So yeah, none of these games work. I don't know whether there were other versions for the Non-MMX chips, but I couldn't really be bothered to go searching on the internet, so I had to think of something else. At this point, I disappeared down another rabbit hole, as if it wasn't enough that all of my testing had gone out the window because I couldn't run the games that I wanted to use. But suddenly, I thought there was something wrong with the Voodoo Banshee because I couldn't get this thing out of 640 by 480 resolution. Every time I did that, it kind of corrupted and threw a bit of a fit and kicked itself back into 16 colours and then still went back to 640 by 480. So I thought, I'm not going to mess about with this right now. I whipped the Voodoo Banshee out of the machine and opened up my Pentium 3 and got my Voodoo 4, which is the only other sort of relatively fast PCI 3D card I've got. So I put the Voodoo 4500 in instead and still had the same problem. And I was scratching my head and I thought, well, I know this card works. And then eventually it clicked. I thought it's got to be the monitor. So I was using this Apple multiple sync monitor, which I really like. I've only ever used it on my older machines, and it suddenly dawned on me this thing must just be a VGA monitor, and that must be all it can do. So I went and swapped it for another 15-inch monitor, and sure enough, that one worked fine with the 4500. But I thought at this point, I'm not going to swap it back to the Banshee. I'll just keep using the 4500 for the sake of this test, and then when I'm finished, I'll put the Banshee back in. So the next challenge was to try and figure out some games to play because I couldn't use the ones that I planned to. So I went digging through my games collection and came up with a few possibilities. So the first one is Baldur's Gate, and it doesn't say anything specifically about MMX, but on the requirements it says the minimum processor requirement is a Pentium 166, no MMX mentioned, and the recommended requirement is a Pentium 200 MMX, so that implies that it must use it, theoretically, so we'll give that a go. And then we've got Starfleet Academy, which doesn't actually say anything at all in the system requirements, but it's got this big Intel MMX badge thing at the bottom left hand corner of the box, so surely that must use MMX, so we'll try that one as well. And then the third one's quite an interesting one because it's Extreme Assault, which is actually a DOS game, and it doesn't mention anything specifically in the system requirements, but on the side of the box at the bottom it's got a little support section, and it says it supports Intel MMX technology, so there you go. We'll give that one a go as well and see if we can figure out a way of benchmarking them. But if I can't benchmark them, I was going to try and use Fraps, but if that doesn't work, I'll just just see how it feels to play it a little bit. I did load 3D Mark 2001 and decided to try my luck with it. I know that this is considerably beyond this machine and was designed for things like GeForce 3s and stuff like that, and it turned out that that was exactly the case, and it was a stupid idea because as it ran through the benchmark, I think about the highest it got was like 4 frames a second or something like that, but for some of the tests it wasn't even getting 1 frame a second, and since the program doesn't do fractions of a frame per second, it was just saying that didn't run and therefore wouldn't complete a full benchmark, so it was kind of pointless. So we're just going to have to stick with 3D Mark 99 and hope that it does use the MMX instruction set. As far as I understand it, MMX only came into being because at this time it was before the wonders of GPUs hadn't arrived yet, so Nvidia's NV1 was still on the horizon, and all of the 3D cards at this point in time shared the burden with the CPU. So the card itself, the graphics card, would do all the kind of drawing type stuff, and the CPU would still do all the integer mathematics. So all the calculating was still a burden on your system. So Intel added these MMX instructions, and I think it was basically to hold more integers that could then have operations performed on them in these separate registers, so therefore it took the weight off the CPU and just made things run a bit smoother. I think there was also some extra sort of stuff to do with sound and general multimedia stuff in there as well. And then of course there was the naming. Everybody didn't know what it stood for, and Intel always said it doesn't stand for anything, but of course it stands for something. But I always thought it was multimedia extensions, but apparently in a court case where AMD and Intel were fighting over something, though it was termed matrix maths extension, so possibly that was the real name, who knows. Okay, so we're going to play a bit of Baldur's Gate now. So this is running on the Pentium 200, the Pentium-s, Non-MMX. So this is just a little bit below the processor spec, recommended spec. This machine has 128 megs of RAM in, I think, so it's way over. I think it was 64 megs from memory that it asks for this. And yeah, it should be well within the spec for comfortable play. And everything seems to be smooth. I was quite happy to play it like this. And it does feel a bit jerky, but I think that's just because the undiscovered parts of the map are they're all blacked out, so you don't know what's there until you go there. And the way that recedes feels a little bit jerky, but I think it's just because it's sort of rolling back pixel by pixel type thing. But the characters themselves all move around smoothly enough, and all the sound and everything's pretty cool. So yeah, this is totally playable even without MMX. Okay, so we'll play a bit of Star Trek Academy now. Now this game doesn't support fraps at all, so no frame counter, not even a corrupted one. It's a lot of FMV in this game, and I don't really think that MMX deals with any of that, because the FMV just plays separately in a player, and there isn't really a lot going on the screen when you're just looking out the window and shooting at stuff, but we'll see how it goes. It's very smooth, plays perfectly well. Well, the sound works nicely, so I would say it would probably be difficult to improve on this, but you never know. It is possible that, you know, people just put those badges in the corner of the boxes because MMX was kind of flavor of the month and it was a selling point. So people who bought MMX processors, if you put an MMX logo on your box, which you're perfectly entitled to do if your game works with an MMX processor, regardless of whether it takes advantage of it or not. So possibly that was just a sales pitch on the box, but we'll find out.
Readying photon tubes. Lower shields are ready. 2 minutes of life support left.
And then we've got Extreme Assault. I love this game. It's super simple. I just like shooting things. And yeah, you can see it's an earlier generation of thing. It's kind of hard to understand how MMX could improve on this, but again, it plays perfectly well with a non-MMX chip. So, you know, all of these games, it's kind of hard to see how they could improve. But yeah, we'll find out. But yeah, it runs nicely on this chip anyway. So finally, last thing for the Pentium-s 200 is we're going to run 3D Mark 99. So we're just going to run through the standard bench, which we did, and that all went pretty as you'd expect. And it rolled in and it gave us a 3D Mark of 807. So I imagine 3D Mark 99, even that is probably a little bit in the future for at least the Pentium, at least the processor side of this machine. And yeah, that is the benchmark that we're going to be comparing with. The other thing I did was, and I think this might be a slightly more useful one, ran the demo mode, which just plows through the sort of game bits of the benchmark, and Fraps works rather nicely in this, so that might be the best comparison of all when we compare it and we can hold them up side by side. So that just whizzed through the complete demo with the counter running, and it'll be interesting to see how that compares with the MMX version, and that'll hopefully give us some differences, assuming of course that 3D Mark 99 does take advantage of the MMX extensions. That's cool, round 1 is over and done with. Time to get the Pentium S200 out and replace it with the Pentium MMX 200. See if the MMX really does kick the ass of the Pentium-s. The Pentium MMX is in and everything's already set up, so there's nothing to do but just get straight into a game. So we'll start with Baldur's Gate, and it just opens and plays and feels exactly the same as it did with no MMX. I do suspect that all of these games are using MMX, saying they support MMX and they will work with MMX rather than that they actually use the instruction set. So it's a shame I couldn't get those other games working, because I think Pod would have been a good one to look at. But I think the 3D Mark demo will probably do the same job. Anyway, this feels identical. It's totally playable, and yeah, nothing to report. So moving on swiftly to Starfleet Academy, and this again feels exactly the same. There's no discernible difference in playing it. It still looks good, feels totally playable, so I don't think this is really taking advantage of MMX either. And finally on the games front, Extreme Assault, and you know, by this time I think my imagination was playing tricks on me, because I did actually think this ran smoother. I was probably just hoping that something was going to be different, but again I don't think it's really worth holding these things up side by side, because I don't think it'll really prove anything, and we'll leave that for the 3D Mark 99 bench, which is what we're going to look at now. So we'll just whiz through the basic benchmark to get a score. Not really worth paying much attention to that, because it's only really the score that we're going to compare. So what does it come in at? And wow, look at that, 903 3D marks. So that's nearly 100 more. So that's probably more than you would expect for variations that might happen just between two 200 megahertz processors. So I guess this actually does. I mean, you would think it would take account of MMX, because MMX had been out a good couple of years before this came out, or a year and a half, 2 years before this came out. And yeah, it's a definite step up. So it's like, what, it's kind of 12-13% improvement. So maybe there is something to MMX after all. Okay, so on to the demo mode. I'm going to run these two side by side for the entire thing. I think it's only about 3 or 4 minutes long, so skip forward if you don't want to watch it. And you can compare the frame counters and see if either of them are faster than the other one. It's probably going to be the best gauge I can come up with that tells us whether or not MMX made any real difference, but from just the kind of games that I would have played, it doesn't really feel like it would have. So that was quite revealing, I guess. I think the MMX one finished the demo about 4 or 5 seconds before the non-MMX one, so it's definitely faster. And you could see on the counter that for the most part the MMX one was slightly ahead, and there was a couple of places where the non-MMX one was slightly ahead, and for large periods of time they were neck and neck. So I guess it depends on what's going on as to whether or not those MMX instructions are actually accessed or not. And there was a short window when this was kind of relevant. 1997 MMX came out, 1999 the GeForce 256 came out, the first GPU, which took a lot of this stuff and did it on the graphics card, so it took the burden away from the CPU anyway. And that was based on the MV10, I think I said MV1 before, and that was shortly followed by the Radeon 7000, I think was the first GPU that ATI did. But I don't think I would have noticed in any of the kind of games. I was playing games like Blade Runner and role-playing games like Baldur's Gate and a lot of real-time strategy, so I probably would not have noticed any difference. So I feel better now that, all those months and weeks that I fretted because I didn't have an MMX processor. When you hold the results of the 3D Mark 99 benchmark side by side, everything on the MMX is ahead by some degree or other. I think the one that's particularly sort of relevant here is probably the synthetic CPU 3D speed. So I guess this is the 3D related processing that the CPU is taking on, which is what the MMX instruction set was there to sort of alleviate. And you can see on the left you've got the MMX processor, which is what was that 1425 versus 1359, I think it is. I can't read because in my editing suite it's a lot smaller than it probably is when you see it, but yeah, on the left MMX is definitely higher. And as you flick through the rest of the scores, the frame rates for the game demos and all of that, the MMX does come out ahead. So I guess it definitely did something, and in certain circumstances you might notice it. I think maybe simulators, I never even thought about that, flight simulators, driving games, things like that are probably the ones where you'd notice it. Well, I wouldn't, because I always played on crappy computers at way below bar performance. Probably blown my mind, actually. But then it would have needed all sorts of extra stuff like graphics cards and things, which I wouldn't have had anyway. So there it is. That's just about it. That was a thoroughly exhausting all sorts of things went wrong making this video. But I think I understand MMX a bit more now, and it was one of those things that I lusted after back in the day that I probably shouldn't have worried about too much. And it's interesting to look back on it now, and it's nice to have MMX processors. And here in this machine I've got my one and only, it probably will remain my one and only, well, Pentium I should say, because all of the Pentium-2s and all the rest of it have it anyway, but it was only significant at this point in time, so it was interesting to take a look. So that's pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed this rambling video, and if you did, it'd be great if you consider subscribing, give me a thumbs up, commenting, loving, hating, all the rest of it. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.